The night the body was found, Paris felt strangely hollow, as if some unseen hand had drawn the city's breath away. A faint mist drifted above the Seine, blurring the lamps along the embankment into soft circles of pale gold, and the stones of the Quai des Orfèvres sweated with the dampness of early dawn. Inspector Moreau stood alone in the courtyard, his coat pulled tight against the cold, staring at the single shuttered window of the room no one admitted existed. It was a room without an address, a chamber without a number, a small forgotten corner of a house that had been swallowed by time itself. And yet a man had died inside it, silently, violently, with no witnesses and no reason anyone could explain. The gendarmes had spoken in whispers, as if the crime might seep into their voices if they dared to talk too loudly. The concierge swore on her late husband's grave that the door to the small room had always been locked, dust settling in the corners like old memories. But someone had entered, and something had remained behind. Moreau watched the fog curl against the window frame. He felt, rather than saw, that the answers waiting inside the unseen room would undo far more than a single man's life. There was a sense, faint but unmistakable, that Paris itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the curtains would finally lift and reveal the truth no one wished to face. And so the night began. If you are drawn to mysteries that unfold with the quiet tension of a ticking clock, to stories where the city becomes a character and the truth stalks its own shadows, then stay with me. And while you settle into the world of Inspector Moreau, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good Parisian mystery. It helps bring these stories to life and keeps the lamp burning in the fog. The staircase leading up to the unseen room felt narrower than it should have been, as if the walls had leaned in over the decades and conspired to press against anyone climbing them. Inspector Moreau placed his hand lightly along the worn wooden railing, feeling the slight tremor of age beneath the varnish that had long since faded. Each step creaked with a complaint that echoed faintly down to the ground floor, where the concierge hovered like a restless sparrow in her wool shawl. Her voice had already filled his notepad with contradictory statements, but he sensed that somewhere beneath her anxieties lay a truth she had not yet given him permission to touch. Moreau continued upward, letting the natural silence of the house gather around him until it settled like fine dust against the shoulders of his coat. The corridor at the top was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a kerosene lamp the gendarmes had left on the hall table. Its light flickered with the slightest draught, and each flicker gave the narrow space a momentary feeling of breath, as though the house itself was exhaling in shallow, uneven rhythms. Moreau paused to listen. He had learned long ago that old buildings spoke more clearly when they believed no one was paying attention. Behind the walls, he heard faint, irregular sounds, likely pipes cooling or a shutter rattling somewhere in the upper rooms, but they seemed too patterned for coincidence, as if mimicking footsteps retreating just beyond his reach. He found the door exactly as he had expected, closed but not fully aligned with the frame. The latch bore a thin trace of polished metal, the kind left behind only when a hand has turned it repeatedly over a short period of time. The gendarmes had been careful not to touch it until he arrived, but someone else had not been. The dust at the base of the door frame had been disturbed in a small crescent shape, as if the door had swung outward recently with uncharacteristic force. Moreau crouched a moment, studying the mark. There was a faint smell on the air, something sharp, metallic, and slightly sweet, like the residue left after extinguishing a candle. It did not belong to the corridor. It belonged to the room beyond. He opened the door gently, letting it drift inward with a sigh. The unseen room greeted him with a stillness so complete that it registered like a physical pressure. It was smaller than he had imagined, barely wide enough for a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small writing desk positioned beneath the shuttered window. Dust lay thick across the floor, except for a single line of footprints leading from the doorway to the bed. only one set. That alone felt wrong. A man had died here, but there was no evidence of struggle, no overturned objects, no signs of intrusion beyond those prints. It was the kind of silence that suggested a meeting of two people who did not raise their voices, not even in fear. The body had already been taken away, leaving behind only an imprint on the mattress where the victim's weight had pressed down the thin ticking. Moreau stood beside it, imagining the final moments. The man's steady breathing before something shifted around him, the sudden awareness of danger, the impossible calculation of escape inside such a confined space. The air still held a faint residue of sweat and pipe smoke, though neither belonged to the victim according to the early reports. The pipe smoke was older, woven into the very fabric of the room, yet Moreau sensed that someone had stood here recently, leaning near the window, their presence enough to disturb the dust on the latch. He moved to the shuttered window and gently pushed one of the slats aside. A cold draught slipped through, carrying with it the echo of distant river sounds, the soft lap of water against stone, the muted clatter of a carriage crossing a bridge. Across the courtyard, the pale dawn was beginning its slow ascent over Paris. The light caught the edges of the rooftops, turning the slate tiles into scattered fragments of silver. Moreau studied the view. There was nothing extraordinary about it, nothing to suggest why a man would seek out such a room or why someone else would kill him in it. And yet, beneath that ordinary veneer, Moreau felt a faint tremor of meaning, as if the city itself were holding back a detail that would shift the entire shape of the case. He stepped back, letting the shutter fall into place, and examined the desk. Its surface was coated with dust except for a small circle where a glass or cup had once rested. Beside it lay a single folded piece of paper, blank as though waiting patiently for words that never came. Moreau touched the paper lightly. It had not yellowed like the rest of the room's contents. It was new, placed here within the last few days. Someone had intended to send a message, or receive one, but the communication had been interrupted by death. The absence of handwriting felt louder than any confession. He closed the desk drawer, then turned slowly in place to take in the entire room. The walls bore marks where pictures had once hung. A wardrobe in the corner stood open, empty except for a faint scent of lavender that suggested the presence of women's hands long ago. The room felt like a memory someone had tried to abandon, but memories have a way of lingering where they are least welcome. As Moreau adjusted his coat and prepared to leave, he noticed something near the bed frame, a small thread caught on a nail. He pulled it free and held it up to the lamplight. It shimmered faintly in the warm glow, revealing itself to be a single strand of expensive fabric, far finer than anything the victim had been wearing. A suit thread, likely. Not the victim's. Someone else had sat on that bed. Someone who did not belong. Downstairs, the concierge waited anxiously in the small entrance hall that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and old furniture polish. As Moreau descended, he heard her shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her impatience tinged with an anxious need to unburden herself. When he reached the last step, she blurted out everything at once. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur, I swear to you that room has been locked for years. No one goes up there. I keep the key myself. Always." Moreau studied her, observing the twitch of her hands as she clutched at her apron. "Yet someone has been inside," he replied calmly. "And not long ago." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked genuinely frightened. "It is impossible. I would have heard footsteps. I hear everything in this house." He believed her. The woman's entire existence revolved around knowing the movements of her tenants, their comings and goings, their quarrels, their illnesses. Her small kingdom depended on vigilance. Yet something had slipped past her, a movement in the shadows of her own domain. That frightened her more than the murder itself. "I'll need to speak to all the tenants," Moreau said, fastening the top button of his coat. "This afternoon. No exceptions." She nodded vigorously. They are all at home today, except Monsieur Bruno on the third floor. He leaves early. Too early, if you ask me." Moreau filed the detail away without comment. Tenants always suspected one another. It was the natural state of shared living. But the tone of her voice hinted at something more personal. Resentment, perhaps, or fear disguised as irritation. As he stepped out onto the street, the morning fog wrapped around him like a thin veil. The air held the crisp scent of damp stone and the distant aroma of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. Life in the city was already stirring, vendors preparing their stalls, clerks hurrying toward early shifts, a coachman flicking the reins of his horse. Yet as Moreau walked away from the house, he felt as though he carried its silence with him, a silence that clung to his coat and whispered questions in the back of his mind. Who had entered the unseen room? Why had the victim chosen such a hidden chamber, a place abandoned by habit but not by purpose? And what secret had hung in the air between him and his unseen visitor in the final moments before death? Moreau paused midway across the bridge overlooking the Seine. The river curled through the heart of Paris like an old story, carrying fragments of lives toward places they never intended to go. He rested his hands on the cold stone parapet and let the morning settle around him. The case had only just begun, yet it already felt as though he were stepping into a narrative that had been unfolding long before the murder took place. A room forgotten by time, a door never truly locked, a man with footsteps that refused to leave clear traces, and somewhere, perhaps closer than he believed, someone who had walked that corridor in the dead of night, careful enough to avoid detection, desperate enough to kill without hesitation. Moreau straightened, pulling himself from the depths of his thoughts. The next steps would lead him back into the lives of the tenants, into the hidden corners of the city, and into the shadows that always gathered whenever truth began to stir. The dust on the latch was not just a sign of entry, it was an invitation to uncover the story behind the silence, and he intended to accept it. The dawn had barely lifted when Inspector Moreau reached his office at the Quai des Orfèvres. Yet the clerks were already at their desks, shuffling papers with the weary rhythm of people who had learned to measure their days by the weight of bureaucratic drudgery. The building hummed with muted conversations, the scent of ink and the faint metallic tang that came from years of cold mornings trapped behind tall windows. Moreau walked straight to his desk, where a thin stack of folders waited like unanswered questions. A cup of black coffee steamed beside them, left by someone who knew the shape of his mornings better than he did himself. He took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle through him, before opening the top folder. The victim's name had been written carefully on the first page, Henri Delacour. A common enough name, almost too common. The handwriting belonged to Janvier, the young inspector who had been first on the scene. Janvier's neat penmanship carried a kind of hopeful precision, as though he believed that clarity of ink could conjure clarity of fact. But Moreau knew better. Names could be masks, entire lives could be inventions, and the truth often preferred to settle in the cracks rather than appear on the page. He scanned the preliminary notes. Estimated age mid-40s, height average, build slight but not fragile. No identifying papers in his pockets except a train ticket stub from 3 weeks ago and a small envelope containing 3 folded sheets of paper, each blank. The concierge had not recognized him, nor had any tenant admitted knowing him. It was as if the man had walked into the house from the fog and died before the world had time to acknowledge his existence. Moreau leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he stared at the name again. Henri Delacour. It should have meant something. The handwriting on the few letters found in the victim's coat pocket, unsigned and unaddressed, suggested a careful, educated man. The strokes were deliberate, the lines evenly spaced. Someone who measured his words before committing them to paper. Yet there were no records, no registration forms, no employment notes. A ghost wearing a borrowed name. He stood abruptly, taking the coat from the back of his chair. There were times when the answers did not lie in ink, but in the voices of people who had brushed against the edges of a stranger's life without realizing it. The café near Saint-Michel, mentioned in the early gossip whispered by the gendarmes, seemed like the first place where the ghost's shadow might begin to take shape. The café sat wedged between a tobacconist and a narrow bookshop, its windows fogged from the night's lingering damp. Inside, the tables bore the scars of decades of cups and elbows, and the air smelled faintly of burned coffee grounds mixed with pipe smoke that clung stubbornly to the fabric of the curtains. A few early patrons sat hunched over their croissants, glancing up only long enough to acknowledge Moreau's presence before returning to their quiet morning rituals. The proprietor behind the counter, a man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, nodded in subdued respect. "Inspector Moreau," he murmured, polishing a glass that did not need polishing. "It has been some time since you visited our little corner." "Tell me," Moreau replied, removing his gloves, "have you seen this man before?" He placed the small identification sketch Janvier had commissioned on the counter. The proprietor, Dupré, studied it with growing recognition, his brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, not often. He came in 3 or 4 times in the past month. Always late. Always alone." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "He drank very slowly, as if trying to make a single cup last the evening." "Did he speak to anyone?" Dupré shook his head. "Not a word. But he listened. You know the type. The kind who keeps to himself but seems to know every conversation happening around him." Moreau nodded. He had known many such men, loners who sought crowded places not for companionship but for camouflage. "Did he seem anxious?" "Not exactly anxious," Dupré said, choosing his words. "More alert, watching the reflections in the window more than the room itself." "Reflections? Yes, as though he feared someone might approach him from behind." That detail lodged itself in Moreau's mind with the weight of something significant. A man who watches reflections is not simply lonely. He is hunted by memory or by someone more tangible. He thanked Dupré and stepped back outside. The street had begun to fill with the sounds of Paris waking fully. The rattle of carts, the murmur of school children, the rhythmic chiming of a nearby church bell. He walked slowly, letting the fragments of information arrange themselves in his thoughts. A man with no past who feared his own reflection. What kind of life had produced such habits? A faint wind stirred along the boulevard, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from a vendor across the street. Moreau approached him, recognizing the man as a habitual observer of the café's late-night clientele. The vendor squinted at the sketch and nodded almost immediately. Yes, I saw him. Walked by here many nights. Took the long way around the block as if he worried someone might be waiting on the short route." The vendor shrugged. He wasn't drunk. Just careful. Careful. Moreau repeated the word silently. What was Henri Delacour afraid of? A debt? An enemy? A memory he could not outrun? The train ticket stub in the victim's pocket pointed toward movement. Paris was not the beginning of his story, merely the place where it ended. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres and sent Janvier to gather old railway station logs while he himself studied the letters found in the victim's pocket. 3 sheets, all blank. Yet the creases suggested repeated handling, as if the man had unfolded and refolded them countless times. Moreau examined the edges. One corner bore the faintest trace of graphite, almost invisible unless held to the sunlight. Someone had once scribbled something there and then erased it. Not carelessly, deliberately, as if the thought had been too dangerous to leave behind. He set the sheets aside. A blank page can be louder than a written one. A knock sounded at his door and Janvier slipped inside holding a small ledger. "The ticket stub matches a route from a town near the Loire," he said. "A quiet place. No major businesses. Mostly vineyards." Moreau took the ledger and skimmed the details. A small station, few passengers, nothing suspicious at first glance. But small places had long memories. "Send a telegram requesting the station master's account of that day," Moreau ordered. "Anyone he remembers standing out. Even silence can be a clue." Janvier nodded and left quickly. Moreau leaned back again, staring at the ceiling. A man had come from a quiet provincial town and tried to vanish inside Paris. He walked the boulevards with the caution of someone who knew he was being followed, or feared he would be. He frequented a cafe not for comfort, but for the safety of crowds. He carried blank letters he could not bring himself to write. He chose an abandoned room, hidden from view, locked to everyone except the person who followed him inside. Yet no fingerprints, no acquaintances, no history. Moreau closed his eyes for a moment, imagining Henri Delacour alive, sitting at the cafe window, the lamplight casting a soft shine across his face, the ghost of a decision weighing in his eyes, the way he held a cup with both hands, as though warming them against more than the cold. A man searching for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps anonymity, and perhaps the courage to disappear. But someone had found him first. As the afternoon light softened into the muted gold of early evening, Moreau stood once more and walked to the window. The Seine below shimmered like a restless secret, its surface broken by passing barges. Somewhere in the city, the past Henri Delacour had fled was beginning to breathe again, pushing its way back into the present. A man with no past was the kind of man whose true story was waiting to be discovered in the shadows he left behind. And Moreau intended to find every one of them. By the time Inspector Moreau returned to the house on Rue des Trois Pignons, the afternoon sky had pressed low over Paris, heavy with clouds that hinted at an approaching rain. The building seemed to shrink more deeply into itself beneath the dull light, its facade worn smooth by years of wind and indifference. Moreau paused at the entrance, inhaling the familiar scent of damp stone mixed with traces of coal smoke drifting from neighboring chimneys. The sounds of the street, vendors calling out their wares, the clang of a bicycle bell, a restless dog barking at nothing in particular, faded as he stepped inside and allowed the door to close behind him. The narrow hallway felt more claustrophobic than it had that morning. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper patterned with small golden fleurs-de-lis that had lost most of their shine. The air was cool, tinged with the lingering aroma of boiled vegetables from a kitchen 2 floors above. Moreau's footsteps echoed softly as he approached the concierge's small desk, where she sat perched like a watchful sentinel, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. "They are all upstairs," she whispered, as if raising her voice might wake something dangerous lurking in the rafters. "Waiting, as you requested." Moreau gave her a reassuring nod before climbing the stairs, his hand brushing the railing once more. The wood felt slightly warmer now, touched by the hands of people who had passed recently. The tenants were anxious. Fear has a way of leaving traces on the surface as it touches. At the top of the stairs, the corridor stretched before him like a dim throat, the kerosene lamp burning weakly on the table, its flame bobbing with each faint draught. He stepped forward, studying the details, the scattered scuffs on the floor, the faint smear of someone's hand against the wall, the subtle shift in atmosphere that suggested unseen movement earlier in the day. The unseen room remained closed. The shadows around its door were deeper, almost crouched, as if the tragedy had soaked into the wood. Moreau began with the seamstress, Madame Lenoir, who lived in the apartment closest to the unseen room. She opened her door cautiously, peering out with narrow eyes before stepping aside to let him in. Her small living space smelled of fabric scraps and lavender water. Spools of thread were scattered across the table, and a half-finished dress hung on a mannequin near the window. She offered him tea, which he declined, and folded her hands in her lap as he began to speak. "Madame Lenoir," he said gently, "you told the concierge that you often hear footsteps at night." Her eyes flickered downward, as if embarrassed by her own words. I work late most nights. I sew until my eyes tire. The house is quiet then, too quiet, so when someone walks through the corridor, I hear it clearly. Did you hear any footsteps the night of the murder? She hesitated. Yes, I heard someone pass my door. It was late, perhaps close to 2 in the morning. Slow steps, not hurried, not fearful. Just steady. Did you open your door? A faint blush rose to her cheeks. No, I was afraid. I often hear things I do not wish to see. Moreau leaned forward slightly. Did the footsteps stop near the unseen room? Yes, she whispered. They stopped, and then I heard the faintest sound, like someone brushing their sleeve against the wall. After that, silence. Moreau thanked her and rose. As he stepped back into the corridor, he pondered her description. Slow steps, calm, intentional. Whoever had walked that corridor had not crept, nor had they rushed. They knew where they were going. Next was Monsieur Rivin, the elderly violin teacher whose apartment smelled of resin and nostalgia. He sat by the window tuning an old instrument as Moreau entered. The notes rang softly, trembling in the stale air. I hear many things in this house, Inspector, he said in a thin voice, but I only speak of what matters. And what matters? Rivin set the violin down. Someone tampered with my locked cupboard last week. I'm certain of it. The latch was loose. My sheet music disturbed. His gaze sharpened. I thought it was the concierge's nephew, that useless boy she sends to run errands. But now I'm not so sure. Did you hear anything the night of the murder? Yes. A door opened, then closed, but I could not tell which one. The sound travels oddly through this corridor. He paused. It is as if the walls swallow certain noises and amplify others. That description lingered in Moreau's mind. The corridor is a living thing, choosing what to reveal. The young couple on the second floor, Claude and Hélène Marchand, offered a different kind of tension. Their apartment smelled of stale tobacco, and the sour aftermath of arguments left unresolved. Claude sat in an armchair, arms crossed defensively, while Hélène twisted a handkerchief between trembling fingers. We heard nothing, Claude said flatly before Moreau could even ask. Hélène shot him a startled glance, then looked away. Moreau caught her hesitation and held it for a moment. Hélène, he said quietly, did you hear footsteps? Anything unusual? She swallowed, her voice barely audible. I heard something. Not footsteps. More like a sigh, or someone muttering to themselves. It came from the corridor. Very faint. Claude stiffened. You're imagining things. No, she whispered, eyes glistening. I'm not. Moreau noted the tension between them, not guilt, but fear straining the threads of their marriage. It was a detail that might matter later. As he returned to the corridor, the air felt heavier, as if carrying the weight of the tenants' fears, their secrets, their quiet suspicions. In old buildings, personal histories overlap like layers of dust, and Moreau had learned long ago that a murder often awakened tensions that had lain dormant for years. He approached the unseen room one more time, placing his hand on the cold latch. The silence behind the door felt different now, not empty, but watchful, as though the room, deprived of its occupant, had begun to listen. Janvier arrived breathless from the stairwell, his notebook flapping in his hand. Inspector, there's something you should hear. Moreau gestured for him to continue. The concierge says she locked the front door last night well before midnight, but Monsieur Bruno, the tenant who leaves early, claims he returned home around 1 in the morning and found it ajar. Moreau frowned. Did he report this earlier? No. He said he didn't think it mattered. Of course he didn't think it mattered. People often dismissed the very details that held cases together. Moreau descended the stairs with Janvier, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the hollow space. Monsieur Bruneau greeted them in his apartment, an austere room with minimal furnishings. He was a man of few words, his expression cold, his gestures deliberate. "Tell me about the door," Moreau said without preamble. Bruneau shrugged. "It was open, not wide, but enough that I noticed. I closed it behind me. That is all. No one in the street? No movement inside?" "No." "And you made no sound as you entered?" "I rarely do," Bruneau replied. There was no arrogance in his tone, merely fact. When the interview ended, Moreau stepped back into the corridor, feeling the day's weight settle more heavily on his shoulders. The pieces were scattered, yet a pattern was beginning to emerge. A door left ajar. Slow footsteps at 2 a.m, a faint sigh, a disturbed cupboard, a man watching reflections, a room never truly forgotten. He walked once more down the corridor, passing each door, his fingers lightly trailing along the wall. As he reached the unseen room again, he paused. The silence around him sharpened into something almost tangible. He could almost hear it, those footsteps from the night before. Steady, unhurried. A presence moving through the shadows with the confidence of someone who belonged to neither the house nor the world outside it. A presence that had ended Henri Delacour's life without hesitation. Moreau let his hand rest on the doorframe, feeling the chill seep into his skin. The corridor was speaking, not with words, but with the echoes of movements made in darkness. Now it was his task to interpret them. The café near the river had been shuttered since morning, its wooden door bearing a crooked sign hastily scribbled with chalk. Fermé pour inventaire. The excuse was thin, almost comical, yet it held an undercurrent of urgency that caught Inspector Moreau's attention the moment he approached. The fog had thickened along the embankment, softening the outline of the café's windows until they resembled frosted panes touched by winter's hand. Moreau paused outside for a moment, observing the faint outline of chairs stacked atop one another inside, their silhouettes distorted by the hazy glass. The place seemed to be holding its breath, as though reluctant to reveal what had transpired the night before. He knocked lightly, more out of politeness than expectation, and heard the muffled sound of footsteps approaching. A moment later, the proprietor, Dupré, cracked the door open and peered out with weary eyes. The man's mustache drooped slightly, betraying the long hours of tension etched across his features. "Inspector," he murmured, opening the door wider. "I thought you might return." Moreau stepped inside, pausing to take in the space as if it were a crime scene of its own. Though no body lay here, the energy was undeniable. An imprint left behind by hurried movements, whispered conversations, and sudden silences. The scent of pipe smoke clung stubbornly to the air despite the proprietor's attempts to air out the room. It mingled with the bitter aroma of overbrewed coffee that lingered in the battered copper pot at the bar. "Has anyone been here since we last spoke?" Moreau asked. Dupré shook his head. "No one. I closed after your visit and instructed my waiter to stay home. I needed time to think." Moreau nodded slowly, aware that the man was not simply afraid of the police inquiry, and he feared the truth he might uncover if he allowed himself too much reflection. The café had become a crossroads for small secrets, a haven for people who passed through life's shadows with quiet steps and downturned eyes. "Tell me about last night," Moreau said, settling into a chair near the counter. "Tell me everything you noticed before and after the man we now know as Henri Delacour left." Dupré took a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the counter in a nervous rhythm. He arrived earlier than usual, perhaps 10 in the evening. He chose the table near the window again, the one where he could see his reflection. And did he behave differently? "A little. He seemed tense. He kept glancing toward the door whenever it opened." "Did anyone join him?" "No, But there was someone who watched him. A man I did not recognize. He sat near the back, pretending to read a newspaper. Moreau's attention sharpened. Describe him. Tall, slender, wore a dark coat. His face was narrow, and he had a scar just beneath his left ear. He never ordered anything. Just sat there, watching Delacour. Moreau leaned forward. And Delacour noticed? Oh, yes. He tried to ignore it, but everyone sees when they are being watched. At one point, Delacour even moved to another table, but the man adjusted his chair and kept him in sight. The image formed clearly in Moreau's mind. A silent tension stretching across the small cafe, the kind that only people who fear recognition understand. Moreau pictured Delacour's hands trembling as he lifted his cup, the way his eyes darted to the mirror-like surface of the window, searching for reassurance. A man running from something always looked into glass, not to admire himself, but to confirm he was still alone. And then? Moreau asked. Delacour left, Dupré whispered. He paid quietly and walked toward the river. The man with the scar waited a minute or two, then followed. Moreau stood abruptly, scanning the cafe with renewed intensity. When you say followed, do you mean casually or intentionally? Dupré's voice dropped. There was nothing casual about it. The man moved with purpose. Moreau felt the terrain shift beneath the case. A man with a scar, a shadow stretching from the cafe to the river, perhaps even to the unseen room. But why? And what was the connection between the two men? He walked toward the table near the window where Delacour had sat. The chair still held a subtle indentation from being occupied recently, and the table bore faint scratches from nervous fingertips pressing against its edge. Moreau lowered himself into the seat, imagining the room from Delacour's vantage point. The fog outside blurred the river into a sheet of reflective silver. Inside, the cafe glowed with muted lamplight, warming the faces of patrons who sought nothing more than warmth and anonymity. From this angle, Moreau noticed a small detail, an ashtray pushed slightly off-center, containing a single fragment of paper no larger than a fingernail. He picked it up carefully. It bore the corner of an envelope. Expensive paper, the kind used by people who guarded their correspondence with an air of gravitas. He raised an eyebrow. Did Delacour receive any letter while here? Dupré shook his head. Not that I saw. Did he tear any paper while sitting here? None. Moreau placed the fragment into his pocket. Someone else had sat at this table after Delacour, or someone had prepared something beforehand. He moved toward the back table where the scarred man had allegedly sat. The chair was angled toward the window in a way that betrayed intent. On the floor beneath it lay a few grains of dark tobacco, a specific kind, coarse and aromatic. Not the cheap blend that Dupré kept behind the counter. Moreau picked up a pinch and rolled it between his fingers, inhaling the scent. This tobacco, do you recognize it? He asked. Dupré frowned. No, too rich, too foreign. It doesn't belong here. Moreau pocketed the grains. A man with a scar, a foreign tobacco blend, a letter fragment. The weight of these small clues pressed into the room like the heaviness before a storm. Did any of your regulars speak to Delacour? Moreau asked. Dupré hesitated. Someone did, Moreau said softly. There was one man, Dupré admitted. He sits in the corner most nights, a student, nervous type. He approached Delacour at one point. I couldn't hear what they said. Did Delacour invite him? No. It seemed the student initiated it. They spoke briefly, and Delacour looked annoyed. The student left soon after. Moreau exhaled slowly. Too many moving pieces. Too many shadows crossing paths in a place that served as a sanctuary for secrets. He stood and walked toward the door. I need the names of your regulars. Every single one, even the ones who've been absent recently. Dupré nodded reluctantly. I'll prepare the list. As Moreau stepped outside, The fog curled around him like a cold hand. The river murmured in the distance, its dark waters swallowing the faint shimmer of lamplight. Paris had begun its slow transformation into evening, and the boulevard hummed with the muted voices of passers-by. But to Moreau, the city felt strangely hollow, as though the cafe's quiet tension had seeped into the streets. He turned toward the stone steps leading down to the riverbank, retracing the path Delacour might have walked. The fog thickened the closer he came to the water, blurring the line between air and river. He imagined Delacour moving through it, alone, fearful, aware that footsteps trailed behind him. A man with a scar, a man who followed deliberately, a man whose presence could silence a room. Moreau paused at the river's edge. The faint smell of tobacco drifted suddenly on the cold air, though no one stood nearby. It felt almost like a memory brushing past him, carried by the fog. He narrowed his eyes, scanning the empty walkway. Someone else had walked this path last night. Someone who did not want to be seen. Someone whose shadow had begun to bleed into the hidden corners of the case. And Moreau knew that the next step would not be taken along the riverbank, but back into the shifting labyrinth of Paris's forgotten rooms, where secrets breathed behind closed doors and footsteps whispered stories only the dead could fully tell. The train to the provinces left Paris under a sky the color of tarnished pewter, its low clouds pressed so close to the earth that they seemed to rest on the chimneys. Inspector Moreau sat by the window, hands folded over the worn leather of his gloves, watching the city recede in a slow procession of rooftops, laundry lines, and narrow courtyards. The Quai des Orfèvres had yielded little more that morning. The telegram from the station near the Loire confirmed that Henri Delacour had arrived on a cold, drizzling evening 3 weeks earlier and departed 2 days after, leaving behind no luggage and almost no impression. Almost. There had been one person who remembered him. A woman whose name had appeared at the bottom of a brief, unfinished note found among Delacour's things. A name written with tentative strokes, as though the writer had hesitated even before committing her to paper. The carriage rocked gently as the train picked up speed, its rhythm reminding Moreau of the countless journeys he had taken over the years, pursuing cases that stretched beyond the city's boundaries and into the quieter corners of France, where the silence of fields concealed as many secrets as the murmur of Parisian streets. He observed his own reflection in the glass, blurred by the motion, a lined face, dark eyes shadowed by too many sleepless nights, hair beginning to thin at the temples. For a fleeting moment, his reflection seemed to merge with that of another man, a pale stranger with wary eyes, and a coat pulled too tightly around him. Henri Delacour, fleeing toward Paris or away from something else entirely. The landscape outside shifted gradually from the crowded outskirts to open countryside. Bare trees stood like thin sentinels along the tracks, their branches scratching faintly against the sky. Small villages appeared and vanished again, their church spires rising briefly before being swallowed by the horizon. A few passengers sat scattered throughout the carriage, a woman knitting in silence, a clerk snoring softly with his hat tilted over his eyes, a young soldier staring out the window with a mixture of boredom and dread that suggested he was returning from leave. None of them looked at Moreau. The inspector's presence had a way of folding itself into the surroundings, as if he were an ordinary traveler whose only burden was the monotony of the journey. Only his eyes betrayed the constant weighing of details, the small observations that built themselves into a map of human behavior. He took the letter from his inner pocket and unfolded it once more. Delacour's handwriting slanted slightly to the right, measured yet restless. The note was not long and not complete. It began with a formality that quickly dissolved into something more fragile. Madame, I do not know if I have the right to trouble your peace after all that has passed. You may prefer to forget my existence altogether, and perhaps you are right, but there are things which refuse to stay buried, no matter how much earth one throws over them. The lines broke off suddenly, no signature, no explanation. Only a name and a town scrawled at the bottom in another hand, perhaps added later. Anne Fournier, Saint-Pierre-des-Vignes. The slightest tremor ran through the ink there, as if the writer's hand had faltered. Moreau folded the letter again and returned it to his pocket. The train slowed as it approached a small station, the screech of metal on metal rising in a familiar complaint. Out the window, he saw a modest platform, a handful of passengers waiting with their collars turned up against the chill, a dog chasing its own shadow along the track. The sign bearing the town's name was chipped but legible. Saint-Pierre-des-Vignes. He stepped down onto the platform, the cold air pressing against his face with a damp insistence. The station smelled of coal smoke and wet wood, the kind of place where time moved more slowly, measured by the arrival and departure of trains rather than the clockwork urgency of city life. The station master greeted him with a respectful nod, his uniform slightly too large for his narrow frame. "You wrote to us about the man," the station master said. "The one who came alone and left alone." "Yes," Moreau replied. "Henri Delacour. You remember him?" "How could I not?" The station master frowned slightly, as if replaying the memory. He arrived on a Tuesday evening. The rain was coming down hard. Most passengers rushed to leave, but he hesitated on the platform, as if unsure whether to stay or return at once. "Did anyone meet him?" Moreau asked. "No one." He asked for directions to the town square, then walked away with the air of a man who knew the streets and yet feared what waited at the end of them. The description fit too well with the impression Moreau already carried. A man torn between past and present, drawn back to something he had tried to sever. He thanked the station master and walked toward the village, the road stretching ahead in a gentle incline lined with low stone walls and dormant vineyards. The vines, stripped of leaves, resembled thin black veins etched into the earth. Saint-Pierre-des-Vignes proved to be a small, orderly place where shutters were painted in neat colors, and the church bell marked the hours with an unhurried dignity. As Moreau crossed the square, he felt several sets of eyes turned toward him from behind lace curtains. Strangers were not common here, and strangers in city coats even less so. He stepped into the small inn to inquire about Anne Fournier, and was directed to a modest house near the edge of the village, where the land began to slope gently toward a line of trees. The house was whitewashed, its garden bare but tidy. A cat sat on the windowsill, tail curled around its paws, watching the world with the indifferent curiosity of animals who have seen every possible variation of human drama. Moreau knocked once, then again. After a few moments, the door opened, and a woman appeared, mid-40s perhaps, with hair pinned back hastily and eyes that had once been bright but now carried a dull layer of fatigue. She studied him cautiously. "Madame Fournier?" Moreau asked. "Yes. I am Inspector Moreau from Paris." He saw the brief flicker in her expression at the mention of the city. "I have come about a man you once knew, Henri Delacour." For a heartbeat, her face seemed to drain of color. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. She did not ask which Henri or what about him. She simply whispered, "So he is dead." The certainty in her tone surprised him. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I'm afraid he is." She stepped aside to let him in, moving with the stiffness of someone carrying an old wound that had never fully healed. The interior of the house smelled of soap and bread, with a faint trace of something floral that might have been perfume applied sparingly. The furniture was simple but carefully arranged, every object placed with deliberate intention. "Sit," she said, gesturing to a chair near the small fireplace. She remained standing for a moment, as if uncertain whether she wished to be questioned or confess of her own accord. "How did you know he was dead?" Moreau asked gently. "He was a man who could only return once," she replied, staring into the fire. "If he had survived whatever brought him back to you, he would have vanished again. That was his nature." "You knew him well," Moreau observed. She gave a bitter smile. Once, a long time ago, before his name was Delacour, the words knotted themselves in Moreau's mind. Before his name was Delacour, the man with no past had, after all, possessed one. He had merely chosen to bury it beneath another. What was his name here? Moreau asked. Henri Varin, she said. He worked at the vineyard on the hill. He lodged at the inn. He walked these streets as though they belonged to him, yet always with the air of someone who might leave at any moment. Why did he leave? You must understand something, Inspector, she said, finally taking a seat opposite him. Henri was a man who believed he could reinvent himself simply by changing locations. When he arrived here years ago, he carried almost nothing. No history, no family, no letters, only a talent for saying just enough to be accepted and never enough to be truly known. And yet you knew him, Moreau said quietly. I believed I did. Her gaze softened for a fleeting instant. He was kind, gentle. But even in kindness, there can be concealment. There were days when his eyes seemed to be watching something far away, as if he lived in two places at once, the present and a past he refused to describe. Did he ever speak of enemies? Debts? She shook her head. No, only of starting over, of becoming someone new. He spoke of Paris often, not as a dream but as an inevitability. Moreau leaned forward. Why did he return 3 weeks ago? At this, her composure faltered. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. He came to ask for forgiveness he did not deserve. For what? For leaving, she whispered. For promising to stay and then disappearing without a word. For letting his silence answer every question I never had the chance to ask. There was no melodrama in her voice, only a quiet exhaustion. Moreau recognized it, a tone he had heard from others left behind by those who believed absence was a form of mercy. Did he mention why he left Paris this time? Moreau asked. Why he came back? He spoke of someone following him, she said. He did not name the man, but he described a presence. I feel eyes on me wherever I go, he said. In the cafe, on the streets, even in the reflection of the train window. He believed that if he came back here, if he retraced the path of his previous life, he might find a way to sever whatever was pursuing him. Did he say what this man wanted? No, but I saw fear in him I had never seen before. Henri Varin had been many things, restless, secretive, careless with the hearts of others, but never afraid. That night his hands trembled as he held his cup. She swallowed. He asked if there was room for him here again, if he could stay. But I am not the woman I was. I told him no, not cruelly, just clearly. And then? He left before dawn, she said. He looked out the window for a long time, as if trying to imprint the town on his memory, and then he walked to the station. I watched him from the hill. The train carried him back to Paris. I knew then that whatever he was fleeing would not be stopped by changing landscapes. The train window, the reflection of a man who had spent his life treating identities like coats one could shrug on or off at will. In that reflection, Henri had perhaps seen not only his pursuer, but also himself, a man whose attempts to start over had finally circled back to meet him. Madame Fournier, Moreau said softly. Did he leave anything with you? A letter? Name? A warning? She hesitated, then stood and crossed to a small drawer in a sideboard. From it, she withdrew a folded scrap of paper and handed it to him. The paper had been torn from a larger envelope, the edges jagged. He dropped this as he left, she said. I meant to throw it away, but somehow I could not. Moreau unfolded it. Written in a different hand from Henri's, in precise, almost elegant script, was a single sentence. You can change your name, Henri, but not what you owe. There was no signature, only the faint imprint of a tobacco stain in the corner, dark and sharply aromatic. the same scent that had lingered in the closed cafe, the same blend scattered beneath the chair of the man with the scar. Moreau looked up from the paper, the faint chill of realization settling over him like a new layer of fog. The shadow that had followed Henry from Paris to this quiet town and back again had a long memory, and it seemed a very deliberate patience. By the time Inspector Moreau's train pulled into Paris again, the city had already begun weaving its own version of Henri Delacour's story. Rumors moved faster than carriages and far more nimbly than facts. They slipped between cafe tables, floated across newspaper columns, and clung to conversations murmured behind closed shutters. It was late afternoon when Moreau stepped onto the platform at Gare d'Austerlitz, but the sky was already dim, thick clouds gathering like restless thoughts. The scent of coal smoke and wet stone returned to him with the familiarity of an old, unwelcome companion. The walk back to the Quai des Orfèvres was brisk, not because Moreau was in any hurry, but because the city itself seemed to nudge him forward. The air felt unsettled, carrying a tension that had grown in his absence. When he reached the tall doors of the police headquarters, he saw a small cluster of newsboys loitering nearby, their eyes sharp with the hunger of young wolves seeking a story. The moment they recognized him, they surged forward. "Monsieur Moreau, is it true the victim was a political informant? Is it true he worked for a clandestine group? Is it true he had been hiding in a room under police protection?" The questions spilled out like coins from a broken purse. Moreau ignored them, pushing through the doors without a word. Inside, the corridor hummed with the subdued disquiet that always followed when the press sank its teeth into a case. He hung his coat on a peg and walked toward his office, where Janvier waited with the uneasy posture of a man caught between curiosity and concern. "The newspapers have begun to invent their own truths," Janvier said as he handed Moreau a folded copy of the Le Courrier de Paris. The headline leapt out immediately. "Mysterious death in a secret room. Who was the man? No one knew." Moreau skimmed the opening lines. The article suggested a clandestine network using abandoned rooms across Paris as meeting points for covert exchanges. The unseen room on Rue des Trois Pignons had been turned into the first chapter of a drama involving espionage, betrayal, and political unrest, none of which had the slightest grounding in fact. The only detail the press had gotten right was that a man had died. Everything else was a tapestry of speculation. The reporters were listening at doors, Janvier said grimly. Some tenants must have spoken out of turn. Or simply felt the need to make the story larger, Moreau replied. A quiet tragedy does not sell as quickly as a conspiracy. He tossed the newspaper aside and opened the small envelope containing the scrap given to him by Anne Fournier. The words still struck with the quiet violence of inevitability. "You can change your name, Henri, but not what you owe." The ink was clean, deliberate. Whoever had written this had not rushed. There was no tremor of desperation or emotion. It was the handwriting of someone who believed in the certainty of their claim. "Janvier," Moreau said, "have you received the analysis of the tobacco grains?" "Yes." Janvier handed him a note from the laboratory. "A foreign blend, likely from the Balkans. Not widely available in Paris." Moreau nodded. A man with a scar, a foreign tobacco blend, a shadow following Henri from the provinces back to Paris. A story that did not need conspiracies to be dangerous. "And the list from Dupray's cafe?" Moreau asked. Janvier placed it on the desk. Moreau scanned the names. Students, a clerk from a nearby government office, a poet of minor reputation, a few men whose occupations were uncertain enough to invite suspicion. But one name near the bottom caught his eye. Etienne Marot, a medical student with a history of nervous breakdowns. Dupray had mentioned a student who had approached Henri briefly. Perhaps this was the one. Before pursuing that lead, however, Moreau wanted to anchor the threads already in hand. He walked to the window, gazing down at the Seine. The river was swollen from recent rains, the waves brushing against the embankment with a soft, persistent urgency. Paris looked almost blurred beneath the thickening dusk, as though the fog had returned to reclaim the edges of every street and every memory. "Inspector," Janvier said cautiously, "I received another telegram while you were on the train." He handed it over. Moreau unfolded it. The message was brief. Stranger seen asking about Henri Varin several days before his departure. Tall man, scar on left side, spoke with foreign accent, left town abruptly. Station master, Saint-Pierre-des-Vignes. Moreau exhaled slowly. Confirmation always came just when he felt the case slipping into ambiguity. The man with the scar was not a phantom or a product of Henri's paranoia. He was real, deliberate, and persistent enough to trace the victim across regions. Yet the question remained. What debt could follow a man across identities and landscapes? He returned to his desk and spread out the evidence. The erased graphite from the blank letters, the tobacco grains, the envelope scrap, the notes from the tenants, the cafe list. The pattern began to form, not clearly, but like a shadow arranging itself gradually into a recognizable shape. Henri Varin, Henri Delacour. Two names, one worn like a discarded coat, the other like an ill-fitting disguise. The man had changed his life more than once, shedding parts of himself in each town he left behind. But someone had followed the trail of discarded selves. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Lucas entered with the brisk confidence of a man unbothered by nuance. "You've seen the papers?" Lucas asked. "Yes," Moreau replied. "They're asking whether we've uncovered a criminal network. They want statements." "And they will receive none," Moreau said. Lucas chuckled. "The chief wants progress. Something clear." "Clarity," Moreau murmured, "is the enemy of truth at this stage." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You think the story is more complicated?" "I think the story is more intimate," Moreau said. "Most murders are." Lucas shrugged, unconvinced, and left. The intimacy of crime, that was something the press could never understand. They always reached for grand designs, webs of intrigue, foreign spies, political plots. But Moreau had learned that the most destructive debts were rarely public. They were personal. A wound inflicted quietly, maybe years before, festering until the moment of rupture. But there was still the matter of the anonymous note that arrived shortly after the article was published. Janvier handed it to him now. "It was left at the front desk," Janvier said. "No one saw who delivered it." The note was written in the same precise script as the scrap Anne Fournier had given him. The dead man sought protection. He came too late. No signature, no address. Yet the certainty in the words struck Moreau deeply. "The press is beginning to shape the story," Janvier said. "No," Moreau replied. "Someone is using the press as a stage. Whoever wrote this is not reacting. They are directing. They want us to know something." "Or want us to think we know something," Janvier suggested. Moreau's gaze returned to the window. The fog outside had rolled in completely now, swallowing the opposite bank. The lamps glowed in pale halos that barely pierced the thick air. Paris in fog was a city of whispers, a place where the truth moved unseen between shadows. Someone out there had watched Henri die long before the blow was struck. Someone who believed in debts. Someone who wanted Inspector Moreau to keep looking. But why? As Moreau stood in the dim office, surrounded by scraps of a man's discarded life, the distant echo of printing presses rumbled through the night. The newspapers would arrive in the morning with new theories, new distortions, new layers of noise. But beneath that noise, the truth waited, quiet, persistent, burdened with its own unrelenting logic. And Moreau knew that the next phase of the investigation would not only peel back the lies of the tenants, the cafe patrons, or the missing stranger with the scar. It would peel back the secrets Henri had tried to bury within himself, because no one flees that far without being chased first by the ghost of his own choices. Night had long folded itself around Paris by the time Inspector Moreau reached Rue des Trois Pignons again. The street lamps, dimmed by the fog, glowed like bruised stars, casting faint, uncertain halos onto the slick cobblestones. The building loomed ahead, its facade retreating into shadow as though reluctant to be seen. A thin drizzle had begun to fall, whispering against the stone steps and leaving a sheen on the railings that reflected the weak light of the lamps. Moreau paused at the entrance, listening, not for sound, but for the subtle tension that clings to a place marked by secrets, and tonight that tension felt sharper, almost metallic, as if the very air had changed in his absence. Inside, the concierge looked up from her chair with startled eyes. She was not expecting him. The hour was late. Her shawl was wrapped tighter than usual, her fingers trembling slightly as she fidgeted with its edge. "Monsieur l'inspecteur," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Someone has been in the corridor." Moreau felt a cold thread weave itself along his spine. "When?" "Not long ago. A few minutes. I heard steps on the floor above. Slow ones. And the door—" She hesitated, glancing toward the staircase as if afraid it had followed her downstairs. "The door to that room. I'm certain it was shut earlier. Now it is ajar." Moreau didn't waste another second. He moved past her, taking the stairs two at a time, the wooden steps groaning beneath his weight. His hand brushed the railing, still slightly warm. Someone had just been here. The corridor above greeted him like a hollow throat, the kerosene lamp casting a trembling glow that deepened every corner. The air held a different scent now, one that didn't belong to the building's usual odors of dust and boiled cabbage. It was faintly sweet, unmistakably foreign, the same scent that clung to the tobacco grains he had found in the cafe. The latch to the unseen room had been disturbed again. He stepped forward, careful not to disturb the silence more than necessary. The door stood slightly open, as if inviting him into a memory he had not yet lived. He pushed it with the back of his hand. It opened with a soft creak, a sound that felt almost too deliberate. The room was darker than before, the shutters still closed, the air thicker. Yet Moreau sensed immediately that something had changed. On the bed, the thin blanket had been tugged slightly out of alignment, as though someone had sat there recently. A chair that had been tucked neatly under the desk now stood, angled toward the window. And near the corner, the dust bore a fresh disruption. It was not a footprint exactly, but the faint smudge of shoe leather brushing against the floor. Moreau crouched to examine it, then noticed something else. A short line in the dust, as though a cane or walking stick had been tapped lightly against the floorboards. The observation brought the image of the scarred man to mind. A tall, slender figure, deliberate in movement, foreign tobacco clinging to his coat. He rose slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the room. Something glimmered near the base of the wall. He knelt and picked it up. A tiny shard of glass. Not from the lamp, not from the window. It was the corner of a bottle. Colorless, with a faint scent of something bitter. He held it beneath the lamplight. Medicine? Alcohol? Poison? Hard to say, but the shard was new. It had not been there during his earlier search. Someone was leaving him breadcrumbs. He turned as the floor creaked behind him, but the corridor remained empty. Only the flickering flame of the kerosene lamp moved, swaying ever so slightly as if disturbed by a presence that had just slipped away. Moreau stepped into the corridor, letting his gaze drift down its length. Doors lined either side, each one a threshold to a different life, a different fear, a different secret. The corridor felt alive tonight, its shadows pulsing with possibilities, its walls holding echoes of the steps the concierge had heard. Someone had walked here not long ago. Someone who felt comfortable enough to return. Someone who believed this place still belonged to them more than to the law. Moreau began knocking on doors. Madame Lenoir opened hers almost immediately. Her eyes were wide, frightened, her sewing basket clutched tightly in her hands. "Did you hear footsteps moments ago?" Moreau asked. She nodded quickly. "Yes, but they were too soft to follow, like someone gliding rather than walking." "Did they stop near this door?" She swallowed. "Yes, I thought I heard breathing." Moreau moved to the next apartment, where Monsieur Rivin answered with his violin still in hand, the bow trembling slightly between his fingers. "Someone was here," Rivin whispered before Moreau could speak. "I heard the faint tap of a cane, or a stick, a soft sound, but distinct." Moreau's mind raced. A cane, a shard of glass, disturbed dust, a scent of foreign tobacco. Everything pointed toward the presence he had been chasing, the figure haunting the edges of Henri's life, the man who sought him out in the café, who followed him across regions, who stepped silently through corridors as though walking through a memory he had replayed 100 times. But why return now? As he reached the end of the corridor, a door creaked open behind him. It was the young wife from the second floor, Hélène Marchand. She stood trembling in her nightdress, her hands gripping the door frame. "Inspector," she whispered. "I heard voices." Moreau turned sharply. "Voices? Where?" She pointed up toward the ceiling. "From the room above us. 2 men. One spoke softly, the other didn't speak at all." "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, but it didn't sound like any of the tenants." Moreau's eyes narrowed. The room above hers belonged to Monsieur Bruneau, the man who entered silently, whose movements eluded even the concierge, the tenant who returned at an impossible hour on the night of the murder, claiming indifference with a calm that had unsettled Moreau from the start. Moreau ascended the final flight of stairs to the 3rd floor, each step a study in restraint. He heard nothing at first, only the muffled hum of the building settling into night. But as he approached Bruneau's door, he felt the faintest vibration, as though someone had moved a moment ago. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Still silence. He tried the handle. Locked. Moreau bent down and examined the keyhole. No normal key was inserted on the inside. Instead, a thin film of dust had been disturbed only around the edges, as though the lock had been manipulated recently. But the dust pattern was not from turning a key. It was from something bracing the lock shut from the inside. He placed his ear against the door. Nothing. Not even breathing. Bruneau was not inside. So who had entered? Who had walked this corridor in the last few minutes, disturbed the unseen room, and vanished like smoke? Moreau walked back down the stairs slowly, letting the silence speak. The corridor seemed to stretch longer than before, as though reshaping itself around the absence of the intruder. Tenants whispered behind their doors. The kerosene lamp flickered weakly, struggling against the weight of the shadows. As he passed the unseen room one last time, he noticed something he had missed earlier, a new mark on the floor just outside the door, a heel mark pressed lightly into the dust. The edge was sharp, recent, and next to it, barely visible, lay a small fleck of brownish red. Moreau crouched and touched it lightly. Blood. Just a drop. A whisper of a struggle. Barely enough to confirm what instinct had screamed. Someone had come back to the scene of the crime. Someone had walked calmly through the corridor, revisiting the room where Henri had died. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Checking something, retrieving something, or leaving something behind. Moreau stared at the drop of blood on his fingertip. The murderer was no longer a distant shadow. He was here. Moving through the same corridors Moreau walked, breathing the same air, brushing against the same walls. And he was getting bolder. Morning arrived without ceremony, as it always did, washing the city in a dull gray that seemed incapable of illuminating anything but the outlines of buildings and the weary faces of those who walked beneath them. Inspector Moreau had not slept. He had remained at the Quai d'Orsay. Orfèvres, through the night, his thoughts pacing the same length of corridor in his mind that his feet had traced at Rue des Trois Pignons. The image of the disturbed dust, the shard of glass, the faint trace of blood, all of it moved in slow circles around one simple fact. The murderer was no longer a distant hypothesis. He was present, confident enough to return, reckless enough to leave a little more of himself behind. The city's newspapers thumped onto the streets before dawn, delivered by boys who shouted headlines they did not understand. This morning, the story had grown another layer. One paper suggested that the unseen room had been a clandestine meeting place between rival factions. Another hinted at a secret lover. Another claimed the victim was a courier for dangerous documents. None of them spoke of a man who had changed his name to avoid a debt of the heart and of the pocket. None of them imagined a foreign tobacco blend lingering like a memory in a corridor. The press preferred epics. The truth tended to begin with something more ordinary. Moreau left the building just as the lamps were sputtering out along the embankment. He walked without haste, his coat buttoned high, the chill air biting at his cheeks. The fog had softened, but not vanished. It still lay low along the river, clinging to the arches of the bridges. As he crossed toward Rue des Trois Pignons, the city felt less like a maze and more like a patient, waiting to see which wound he would examine next. Outside the house, the concierge was already sweeping the steps, her movements brisk, mechanical. She looked up as he approached, her eyes shadowed by a night of broken sleep. "Nothing more, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," she said before he could ask. No footsteps, no doors, just the silence. "The silence is often where the last truth hides," Moreau replied gently. He went upstairs, not to the unseen room first, but to the second floor where Hélène Marchand answered his knock with the wary expression of someone learning that fear can move in and take up residence, rearranging all the furniture of one's mind. Her husband hovered behind her, arms crossed, suspicion etched into his posture. "Madame," Moreau said, "you told me last night that you heard two men, one speaking, one silent. Think carefully. Did you recognize anything about the voice? An accent? A tone?" She closed her eyes for a moment, listening inward. "Soft," she said. "Measured. Not hurried. The voice of someone used to giving instructions without raising them. French? Yes. But there was something else. A slight trace of something I couldn't place. Like a person who has lived elsewhere for a long time and is pretending not to." "And the other man?" She opened her eyes. He did not speak, but I could hear his breathing, shallow, frightened. Henri, Moreau thought. Henri, who had changed names like coats and still found himself backed into the same corner. He thanked her and continued upward. On the third floor, Monsieur Bruneau's door remained locked, its wood bearing the unremarkable face of a man who prefers to be neither seen nor remembered. Moreau examined the lock again. This time, in the thin daylight, he noticed something new. A faint scuff on the lower part of the door, as if a shoe had pressed against it from inside while someone manipulated the lock. A clumsy barricade used recently. Bruneau was absent now, but he had not been absent last night. The corridor had not been visited by a ghost alone. Back at headquarters, Janvier met him with a mixture of excitement and unease. "Inspector," he said, "we found the medical student, Etienne Moreau, the one from Dupray's cafe. He came in himself." "Of his own accord?" Moreau asked. "Yes. He said he was afraid of what the newspapers might say if he did not." They brought the young man into Moreau's office. Moreau was thin, pale, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness that did not come from late-night study. He twisted his cap in his hands, fingers moving over the fabric as though searching for reassurance. "Etienne," Moreau began, his tone calm, "you spoke to Henri Delacour the night he died." "Why?" Moreau swallowed. "A man asked me to. A stranger. He said he would pay." "What did he ask you to do?" "To approach the man at the window. to tell him that time was running out, that he should meet in the room on Rue des Trois Pignons if he wanted a chance to settle things. He said the man would understand. Describe this stranger. Moreau's gaze flickered. Tall, thin, scar along his jaw. He smelled strongly of tobacco, a kind I've never smelled before. He spoke softly with an accent, not heavy, but present. The same man Dupré saw watching Henri, Moreau said quietly. Yes, Moreau whispered. He said it was just a message, that he was helping a friend collect a debt. I did not think. His voice broke slightly. I did not think it would end in death. Did he give his name? Moreau asked. He called himself Novak, Marat said. But I don't know if that was true. Moreau let the name sit in the air for a moment. It fit the scent of the tobacco, the foreign edge to the French, the long patience of someone used to crossing borders with a purpose that did not appear on any official ledger. What debt? Moreau asked quietly. Marat shook his head helplessly. He didn't say, only that the man at the window had been playing a long game of running away. That game's end. The words echoed the note Henri's pursuer had sent. You can change your name, but not what you owe. Moreau felt something tighten in his chest, an old familiar feeling whenever he stood on the threshold of a truth that was neither satisfying nor clean, but inevitable. He let Moreau go with a warning, not a threat. The young man had been a pawn, chosen for his nerves and need of money, not for courage. The real weight of decision had lain elsewhere. By late afternoon, they had located Bruno. He was found down near the river, walking with the same deliberate calm he had displayed in every conversation. When the gendarmes approached, he did not run. He only looked up, eyes expressionless, as though he had been expecting this moment to arrive with the same certainty as the turning of seasons. In the interrogation room, Bruno sat upright, hands folded on the table, the picture of quiet obedience. Yet Moreau saw the tension in the set of his jaw, the way his thumb tapped nearly imperceptibly against his other fingers. You have been renting the unseen room, Moreau said, without preamble. Not through the official landlord, through the concierge's nephew, for cash. Bruno's mouth tightened briefly, then relaxed. Sometimes, men need a place to speak, to forget who they are for an hour. Men like Novak? Moreau asked. A flash of surprise crossed Bruno's features. It was slight, but it was there. If that is what he calls himself. You let him use the room, Moreau continued, and when Henri returned to Paris and needed refuge, he came to you as well. Or was it Novak who sent him there? Bruno exhaled slowly. I do not ask who sends whom. I open doors. I close them, that is all. Moreau studied him. The night Henri died, you were here. You came home late, found the street door ajar, claimed it meant nothing, but it did. You came up the stairs, you heard voices in the corridor, you heard the unseen room open. A muscle jumped in Bruno's cheek. You stood outside the door, Moreau said quietly. You listened. Bruno looked down at his folded hands. When he spoke, his voice carried no drama, only a slow, reluctant resignation. He was asking for more time, he said. I heard it. He begged. He said he had nothing left, that he could not go back to the life he had escaped. The other man, Novak, told him debts are like shadows. They lengthen at dusk. They do not disappear. What happened then? A chair scraped. A bottle broke. There was a sound, a dull one, like a head against wood. His gaze drifted toward the wall, unfocused. Then silence. You did not go in, Moreau said. No. Why? Bruno's throat worked. Because I have lived long enough to know when a door is not meant for me. When men like that settle their affairs, it is better not to be in the room. Yet afterward, Moreau said, you helped him. Bruno's eyes flicked back to his. I did not touch the body. But you let Novak come back, Moreau continued. You let him enter the corridor again. You let him stand in that room, sit on that bed, leave behind the shard and the tobacco and a drop of his own blood when he brushed against the nail in the frame. Bruno's silence was confirmation enough. "Why did he return?" Moreau asked. "To make sure nothing was left behind," Bruno said. "He said careless men leave trails. He is not careless." "Except this time," Moreau murmured. They pressed him for more. Names, places, any suggestion of the deeper story tying Henri to the scarred man. Some details came, not as a full confession, but as fragments. Henri had once been involved in moving things across borders, goods, perhaps, or information. Not grand secrets, not dramatic contraband, but enough to earn money that did not like daylight. At some point, he had vanished with more than his share. Years later, the debt had come to collect. "Is that the whole truth?" Janvier asked afterwards, when Bruno had been led away to a cell. "No," Moreau said. "It is the part of it we can prove." Novak, if that was his real name, melted back into the fog of the city as easily as he had emerged from it. They traced whispers of him near the stations, in a riverside lodging house beside a tobacco shop that stocked rare blends. Each time they arrived, they found only the faint echo of his presence. A paid bill, a recently vacated room, an impression of a scarred face in someone's uncertain memory. He remained, as far as the official file was concerned, an absence with sharp edges. The unseen room was eventually sealed. Not legally, not ceremonially, simply with a strip of wood across the door and instructions from the landlord that no one was to enter again. The concierge avoided that floor when she could. Tenants began to speak of moving. The corridor gradually regained the quiet rhythm of ordinary lives, but it never entirely lost the sense that something had unfolded there which had not been fully understood. Weeks later, when the last of the formalities had been completed and the file on Henri Delacour, Henri Varin, had moved from the top of Moreau's stack to somewhere near the middle, the inspector walked alone along the Seine at dawn. The air was cold but clear. The fog lifted for once, leaving the outlines of the city sharp against a pale sky. Barges moved slowly along the water, leaving ripples that spread outward and vanished. He stopped near the bridge and rested his hands on the stone parapet. The city was waking behind him, shutters opening, a baker sweeping his threshold, a milk cart rattling over the cobbles. In the window of a nearby building he saw his reflection again, his own face, superimposed briefly over that of the river, like the image of a traveler glimpsed in a night carriage. He thought of Henri, staring into reflections in café glass, searching for pursuers and finding only himself. A man who had tried to escape his past by locking himself in new rooms, in new names, in new towns. Yet in the end, the room where he died had not been locked at all. The latch was faulty, the key unnecessary. The barrier he believed he had placed between himself and what he owed had never truly existed. Most people, Moreau reflected, kept such rooms inside. Themselves, unseen chambers where old debts, longings, betrayals, and fears were stored. They told themselves the doors were sealed, the keys lost, the corridors leading there forgotten. But the past had a stubborn habit of knowing the way back. It did not always come with a scarred man and a foreign tobacco scent. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a letter never written, a woman in a provincial town who refused to forgive, a station master who still remembered a face from a rainy evening. Sometimes it came in the quiet voice of an inspector asking questions no one wanted to answer. He straightened, drawing in the cold air. The case was closed in the only way such cases ever truly were, with enough truth to satisfy the law, but never enough to heal the private wounds it had exposed. Henri's death would become a short article in the archives, then a line in a ledger, then, eventually, nothing more than a fading recollection in the minds of a few people who had known him under one name or another. But for Moreau, the unseen room would remain, not as a place, but as an image. A small chamber above a narrow corridor, dust disturbed on the latch, a bed bearing the impression of a man who had tried to hide from himself. A door that had never been locked, and a shadow that had always known how to cross its threshold. He turned away from the river and began to walk back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, where other files waited, other quiet tragedies, other rooms no one wished to enter. The city around him stirred fully now, filling with the ordinary noise of life. But beneath that noise, Paris held on to its secrets, as it always did, like a house full of unseen rooms whose doors might open at any moment, without warning, onto stories that had never really ended. And Inspector Moreau, coat collar turned up against the cold, walked toward them with the measured step of a man who understood that the most important doors are not the ones we close, but the ones we tell ourselves were closed all along.